Hello.
Hi, Luann. How are you?
Good. How are you? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you virtually.
Okay, I'm making you a co-host.
Great. So I'll be able to share my screen.
Yeah, and we are recording. Is that okay with
That's
you?
fine. Yeah, perfectly okay. Yeah. And how long do you want me to speak in terms of canned length, and then how much space left for Q&A and discussion?
So formally the course goes till 10 of 5, but we don't have to go that long. So I would say 40 to 50 minutes and then Q&A, and for
Okay.
as long as you
As long
want
as there's
to.
interest. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Okay.
so it's kind of up to you.
Okay. And do you want to moderate the Q&A, or should I just moderate it myself?
I'm happy to moderate. I think what I'm going to do, I'm a little bit nervous about Zoom bombing. This happened last year during the seminar.
Oh, did it? Okay.
Yeah, so because we advertise it pretty broadly, I don't think it'll happen this year, but anyway, so I'm going to open the chat.
Sure, that's fine.
At the end of the seminar.
Okay.
And let them ask via chat.
Okay.
And then we can see how it's going, and if everyone's behaved, then we'll open it up.
If we get bombed, I won't panic. Don't worry.
Yeah, I mean, it was just sort of like, I have a waiting room, which I think helps because people get impatient and don't want to wait to be admitted if they're bombing it. So anyway, I think that's what I have. Let me see. Let's see. Yeah, I don't. I'm not going to let them start their video or unmute themselves, and then I'll open chat at the end. Unless you prefer to have conversation during.
It's entirely up to you. I can do either.
Okay, why don't we do that? Just because I think it'll be better.
Okay, sure.
Just in case.
Yeah.
You haven't experienced that yet, Zoom bombing?
Haven't had one. No.
Yeah. So, how do you say your university?
Good question. Wilfrid Laurier.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. In Ontario. Yeah.
Yeah.
My French, my middle school, my high school French comes in useful.
Okay, yeah.
Every once in a while. So, okay, I'm going to start to admit folks.
Sure.
So the director, I wonder if I can unmute Becky at least, and she can say hello to you.
There we go. Hi, sorry, I tried to do that earlier, but it wouldn't let me.
Yeah, I'm keeping it locked. I'm keeping it locked down.
Yeah.
Just until the end, and then by then, hopefully the Zoom bombers will have left. Anyway, this is Becky Alexander. She's the director of the program on climate change this year. And so anyway, just thought I'd introduce you. Do you go by Robert?
Yep, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so
I'm just wondering, Becky, did we meet in Portland a couple of years ago?
I don't think so.
Were you at an event at Portland State University?
No.
No.
Was that on migration?
Yeah, on migration to.
I was there.
You were there, Luann. Okay.
I was there. Yeah, I was there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So everyone can see us right now. We are, just for those who are entering, we're going to keep you muted until the end, so that we can sort of keep it under control, and then we'll allow people to ask questions in chat and in person at the end of the seminar. So the three of us are chatting, and we won't say anything inappropriate as people gather.
Try not to.
Yeah, that was an interesting get together.
It was. It was. Essentially, they wanted to know how many Californians and Arizonans are going to show up in the Pacific Northwest in coming decades.
Yeah, well, they didn't experience last year's heat with no AC and wildfires and
Yeah.
all that stuff. So I'm not sure we're as much of a refuge as people
Mhm.
thought.
How many folks are you expecting, Luann?
It really varies. I would say sometimes there's 30 or 40, and it's getting towards week 6, so there may be fewer. It is week 6 right now, right, Becky? Or week 5? I can't remember, out of a 10 quarter. So we're sort of mid-quarter, midterms times. I did just send out a reminder that we were online, so hopefully people will, because normally the seminars are in person, but this week and next week is they're both online. Give people a few more minutes to come in. So I did have the students read one of your other papers, not the one you suggested, but based on the discussion boards, they were super interested in it. And it was more focused on migration. So would you do the working group 2 report again?
Nope, not in a million years.
That's what I don't know if you interacted with Jeremy Hess.
He was part of my team, part of my chapter
Yes.
team. Mhm.
So he said, no way would he do it again. And Chris Ebi, of course, spoke earlier in the quarter, and no.
She has a different energy level than the rest of us.
She seems to really enjoy this international stuff.
Yeah,
So
it's too great a commitment. Yeah, so no, it was one of those things that you try it and you're glad you tried it, and you would never go near it.
yeah, my husband did it in the 2013 working group 1,
Okay.
and I think he's glad he did it, but once again, once is enough. Okay, so I think we've got 24, and I'm guessing more will sign on, and I'll pay attention to the
We got quorum, have we?
we have quorum, yeah. And I asked you the most important question about whether or not you would work on the working group report again in the future. So I just wanted to tell everyone what we're going to do today is we're going to keep everyone muted, no videos until the end. Oh, good, Marion's is accepting them now. And then we'll allow people to ask questions in chat and to unmute themselves. But this is sort of to just focus on the talk, the first part of the session. So Chris Ebi suggested Robert McLeman to come and speak, and I'm really thrilled that he agreed to speak to us. He's another lead author on the IPCC report, along with Chris and Jeremy. So he's going to give us our perspective on his contributions to research in migration and conflict. So he's a professor of geography and environmental studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada. And he was a lead author on the health, well-being, and the changing structure of communities of the Working Group 2 IPCC report. And he's going to talk to us today about migration and conflict. So take it away, Robert. Oh, and I assume you're able to share your slides at this point.
I'm hoping so. I'll fire them up in just a moment.
Yeah.
And so, well, thank you, Luann, and thanks everybody for attending and for having me as part of the seminar series at UW. I have to be careful when I say UW because we also have a UW here in Canada, and it's not far from here, University of Waterloo, but I think we all know who we're talking about. I'd like to say it's nice to be back in Seattle. I guess virtually doesn't really count though. So I'm hoping next time, Luann, you can fly me out and get me out there in person. I used to live in Seattle back in the 1990s, back when Seattle was sort of the epicenter of North American popular culture. And it was a great time to be there. And I have many fond memories of Seattle. So thanks very much for having me. I didn't really have much to do with UW when I was there, other than I would occasionally paddle a kayak through the cut there past the football stadium. Anyhow, I've been invited to talk about migration and conflict and the links to climate change. I'm going to focus primarily on the migration part of it. And the reason being, the short answer is that there's not a lot of evidence that climate change causes people to go out and kill one another, at least not yet. There's a few examples where climate change has caused conflicts, but it tends to be small-scale, localized conflicts within communities and countries. And it's not even like a single causal factor. It's more a factor that adds to others, political tensions, cultural tensions, and so on. I just want to see if you can see my screen okay.
We don't see presenter view. We see.
How's that look now?
It's still the same. Let's see. Yep, there you go.
Okay. Good. Okay. So I'm going to focus primarily on migration and displacement, where there's a lot more evidence that weather events, extreme weather, shifts in climate actually do lead people to move from one place to another. And so I have a little title slide here: climate change, migration, and insert an ominous statement about our common future. I've given this sort of talk a number of times at different universities. And so I tried to tailor it, but I've run out of, catchy ways to describe what the future will be like. So I'm leaving that blank here. As Luann mentioned, I've been involved in the IPCC in the most recent reporting cycle. I've been doing research on the links between climate change and human migration for quite some time now. I did my master's degree back in the early 90s, and I actually did a study on how sea level rise would affect communities in South and Southeast Asia for my master's degree back in the 90s, when climate science was still a relatively new thing to talk about. And I can still continue to do climate change work, adaptation, migration, displacement, and so on. So that's a little bit about my background, in addition to my having lived in Seattle. Let's start with about a year ago, almost to the day, not quite, your president, Joe Biden, requested a study be commissioned on the implications of climate change for migration and refugees. And it was published in the fall, the special report from the White House. It was kind of a landmark. It's the first time certainly in North American history, where a world leader, said climate change is something we need to think about in terms of its impacts on people's where people live and where they're going to live in the future. So that was like a huge elevation of the profile of the links between climate and migration. Prior to that time, well, I won't bother boring you with the details about your previous president or presidents prior to that. There was varying degrees of interest in climate change, but no president had really taken a focus on the implications for migration and refugees. I think it's also topical to talk about what's going on right now in India. Right now, the temperature, actually, this is a couple hours ago, I took the temperature, I downloaded the temperature in New Delhi, 109 degrees Fahrenheit. The high tomorrow in New Delhi is going to be 111 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pushing the upper boundaries of what is survivable by the human species, right? We have a temperature threshold that we're comfortable living within. Once you get up above 110, you're really starting to push the limits of the human body's ability to survive. And you can see that these temperatures are persistent right now. The overnight temperatures are going just down into the mid to low 80s. So there's no relief from the heat. And this is the sort of thing that's going to become more and more common in coming decades as a result of a changing climate. There's going to be a lot of cities, not just New Delhi and not just India as a country, where the climate is becoming difficult to survive. And not just for heat, but for other disasters as well. So I'll talk about those in a few minutes. It's worth also noting that this isn't normal. Temperatures should not be this hot in India at this time of the year. It's a little bit early in the year to be pushing up into the 110s, the one in the teens and so on. Then again, I guess I don't need to tell people who live in Washington State about hot temperatures because last summer, I think you folks had some temperatures that were Delhi-like as well, up into the hundreds. I know in Canada, there was a community in British Columbia in the interior that almost hit 50 degrees Celsius. Now, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. I'm afraid it's Canadian Fahrenheit's not something I use very often. But 50 degrees Celsius, I think, is like the high teens, almost 120 Fahrenheit. Like, that's just ridiculous. That's just not normal. No other way to describe it. But anyhow, this is the kind of stuff that people are talking about right now. And I understand that you were asked to read this particular article, the students in this course, that I co-wrote with my dear friend Laurie Hunter at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm actually glad that Luann selected this one for you to read, because it really tees up a sort of a little bit of self-reflection, if you will, in the context of how climate affects people's movements. Because the United States has had a great many events over the last century or so where large numbers of people had to leave their homes because of weather or climate-related events. And so I want to talk about one of those right now to sort of lead us into sort of a past, present, and future perspective on the linkages between climate and migration. I suspect that many of you may have read this book in the upper right-hand corner. If you went to school in the United States, if you went to high school in the US, it's often, I think John Steinbeck is the author who US secondary school students are most often expected to read as part of their English literature courses, Grapes of Wrath being his most famous book. If you haven't read it, The Grapes of Wrath is the story of a fictional family from Oklahoma that migrates to California in the heart of the Dust Bowl, which was a period of extreme heat and dryness in the southern part of the US Great Plains. And the fictional Jode family leaves Sallisaw, Oklahoma, and makes their way across land to a place called Bakersfield in California, Kern County, California. And as part of my PhD research back almost 20 years ago, I guess it was about 20 years ago, I was in a graduate seminar class. And I had planned back then that I was going to go to Central America and study the impacts of Hurricane Mitch on displacement patterns in Central America. Mitch was a big hurricane in 1999 that set off the coast of Honduras and essentially just drenched Central America for several days. And tens of thousands of homes were destroyed and hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. And that was what I was going to do as a PhD student, was to go down there for my field research and try to figure out what happened to those folks 3 years after the fact. But then I was sitting in a grad seminar course like this, and we got to talking about the Dust Bowl migration and Grapes of Wrath when I mentioned people that my research was on the subject of, weather and climate and migration. And it sort of came up in the seminar. We were thinking about it and realized that in 2002, a lot of the folks had passed away, but there were still folks who had participated in the 1930s Dust Bowl migration who were still alive in the early 2000s. And so it dawned on me that this might be a last chance opportunity to talk to people who actually participated in the biggest environmental migration in American history, the Dust Bowl migration. When it's estimated that 300,000 people migrated to Southern California from the Southern Great Plains in the 1930s, a lot of them because they had lost their homes, their jobs, their livelihoods because of the combination of extreme drought and the economic hardship of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So I actually did that. I went to, as my PhD research, I flew to Kern County, California, flew to Bakersfield, and interviewed a bunch of folks who, as young people, had migrated with their families to California from Oklahoma. And then I flew back to Oklahoma, or I flew to Oklahoma, to the counties where they migrated from. And I interviewed people who had lived through the Dust Bowl, but had not migrated. So I had a compare and contrast study, comparing folks who migrated to folks who didn't migrate, to find out what distinguished households that left Oklahoma during the droughts and those that stayed behind. So that was sort of my PhD research. And just to give you a few images of the Dust Bowl era, these are all images from the U.S. Library of Congress collection, unless it says otherwise. And if you've ever heard about the Dust Bowl, this is what it looks like, right? So you're talking about an area from northeastern New Mexico up into Colorado, eastern Colorado, in through the Texas Panhandle, the Oklahoma Panhandle, up into Kansas, and so on, where from about 1932 to 1936, it just hardly ever rained. And this is a normally dry place to begin with, but it simply never rained. And so the folks who lived there, who were primarily farmers who, ran a 50, 100-acre farms and so on, they were completely left without livelihood. And so many of them abandoned their farms. Those who weren't farmers, their jobs were often tied to the agricultural economy. People weren't getting harvests out. People were having to get rid of their livestock herds. And there were no other jobs because it was the heart of the Great Depression. So if you didn't have an income from farming, there was no job that you could fall back on. And so a lot of folks simply left. And when you think about it, it probably for a lot of them wasn't such a bad idea after all, because this was one of the poorest parts of the United States in the 1930s. What you see here is an image of a tenant farmer's house near Sallisaw, Oklahoma. This is in the eastern part of Oklahoma. And this is what folks were living in. So this was, abandoning this wasn't such a bad idea for a lot of folks. There wasn't a lot of wealth. There were landowners, and the landowners tended to stay put throughout the droughts. But the tenant farmers, who represented the bulk of the population in eastern Oklahoma, they couldn't pay their rent. They had to give up their farms, and they didn't stick around. And as you can see, the quality of the housing, there was no reason to stick around, right? If you could afford to get out, you did. And even if you couldn't afford to get out, you tried your best to get out and go to California or other parts on the West Coast where there might be better opportunities for folks. Washington State also received a lot of migrants from the Great Plains as well, but they tended to be folks from farther north, up into the Dakotas, Nebraska, that area. They tended to make their way due west to Oregon and Washington State. I like this photo a lot. It's a photo by the very famous American photographer Dorothea Lange, who took a lot of Depression-era photographs of the Dust Bowl migrants. And this is simply called Roadside Family. And I like this photograph because this snapshot captures precisely who the folks were that left Oklahoma, who left Texas, who left New Mexico, and moved to California. Young families, working age, with kids, they picked up and they left because they needed to work, they wanted to work, they scraped together enough money to rent a car or borrow a car, or if they owned a car, they drove it west. In this case, the family didn't have enough money to drive west, but they hitchhiked their way west and so on. They got the heck out of the Southern Great Plains. And what that meant was that they left the Great Plains. The folks who stayed behind tended to come from the upper end of the economic spectrum, of whom there weren't a whole lot, but there were, and the lower end of the economic spectrum. So folks who own farms, who own businesses, they tended to stay in the Great Plains. The middle class, the rural middle class, young families, they left. And the poorest of the poor, often folks with broken homes or physical disabilities or elderly poor and so on, who might have wanted to get out of Oklahoma, out of Texas and so on, who wanted to get out. They couldn't afford to. They had no means, physical means to get out of there. So essentially what happened in the Southern Great Plains is you lost your rural middle class. These communities were just gutted. And if you were to go to those communities to this day, to places like Sallisaw and some of the smaller communities around there in Oklahoma, you will find it's still pretty much the same thing to this day. There's very few young people, very little of a middle class there, but some real in sort of incorporated poverty, and a few folks who own most of the assets. And any community that loses its middle class is pretty much finished, who loses those young families and so on. Now, where did these folks end up when they ended up in California? Some, if they were lucky, they had friends or relatives that they could live with. Others couldn't afford housing, and so they essentially lived in what we would consider today to be refugee camps that sprang up along roadsides, along drainage ditches in different parts of Southern California. Here's a picture of one. You can see these folks, they have a tent and they have a stove. You know, if you spray painted a powder blue UN on the roof of that tent, you might be easily fooled into thinking that you were looking at a refugee camp somewhere in Africa or the Middle East or South Asia today, but in fact it's California in 1936. And things got so bad, especially, you know, so from 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, you were seeing these waves of people migrating from the Great Plains to California, that the US government stepped in under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they created something called the Farm Security Administration that actually built labor migrant camps, so that folks arriving from the Great Plains had some place formal that they could live. And so what you see here on the right-hand side, I think that's in Arvin, California. That's one of these migrant worker camps, so that the folks had, you know, sanitation and things like that to get themselves established in California until they could find housing. The interesting thing, two interesting things about this. One is these camps, some of them are still in operation to this day. They house migrant workers from Mexico and Central America who come up to California and work in the fields in California. The other thing that's interesting is this particular camp, John Steinbeck, who was actually a journalist before he became a novelist, actually went to this migrant camp, and as part of some newspaper reporting he was doing, and he ended up staying there for extended periods of time and collecting stories from the migrants about their journey and their experience coming to California. And so although The Grapes of Wrath is purely a work of fiction, in the narrowest sense, it's a work of fiction, but in fact, it is an amalgam of a whole bunch of stories and real life tales that Steinbeck collected using his reporter's hat that he then fictionalized. And the reason these folks went to California is because there was work. And typically they also had family ties because they'd had cousins or neighbors or friends who had gone on before them who had also found work. And so people started to follow in their wake, family connections and so on. And the photograph you see here, these are Oklahomans who are working in the cotton fields in Kern, California in the 1930s. I know folks don't typically think of cotton, they think of the southeastern part of the United States, but Kern County, if you've ever been there around Bakersfield, it looks like the Great Plains. There's oil rigs, there's oil wells, there's big flat farm fields, and back in the 30s, they grew a lot of cotton. They still grow a bit of cotton there to this day. And one of the things that drew folks from Oklahoma to California was, one, they knew how to work with cotton, which was not an easy crop and which was not mechanized in the 1930s. And two, the US government, one of the things they did at the start of the Great Depression was they closed the US border to Mexican migrant workers. And so the farms in California suddenly found themselves without labor. And because, you know, prior to the Depression, just like after the Depression, most of the farm work in California was done by Central Americans and Mexicans, as it is to this day. But in that period in the 1930s, the government, in order to protect American jobs, closed the border, prevented migrant workers from coming in from Mexico. And so Oklahomans filled that gulf, that gap in the labor market during the 1930s. And that's what you see there in that photograph. The places they left behind, just a couple images that I wanted to throw in at the end, because I was interested in the place it left behind. This is farmland that once upon a time in the 1930s supported 4 households. You can see in the background, there's these tree lines, and those tree lines are the boundaries from the former tenant farms that used to be operated in the 30s and so on, that people fled. But I bring it to your attention for two reasons. One is that there's no houses visible, right? These farms were abandoned and they were incorporated into a larger farm by the landowner. The second thing is, look at the foreground. Look how badly damaged the soil is. This farmland, the folks who run this farm are tremendously careful stewards of the land. The land had been completely destroyed in the 1930s by cotton farming. And the reason was that you had all these tenant farmers who were farming the land. And cotton, I don't know if you know much about cotton, but cotton is extremely destructive. It requires tremendous amounts of moisture. It requires tremendous amounts of fertilizer. Is very susceptible to diseases and so on. And so what tends to happen is it very quickly depletes and damages the soil. And that's what happened to this land, is that in the 30s, when farmers were going broke, they worked the land too hard, and they destroyed the fertility, the fertile layer, the top layer of the soil. And it has taken decades for the farmers who now work this land to help the soil recover its fertility. And so the farmers, the family who runs this farm now, they spend a lot of time and effort using fertilizers, natural fertilizers primarily, careful grazing and rotating of stock and so on to try and build up the fertility of that soil. But it's still very easily eroded and damaged. And just to finish up, there's the folks who run the farm, who were running the farm in the early 2000s. These are the Ryder family. Eugenie on the left, Mrs. Ryder, she was born on that farm, and her husband, Tom, on the right, he was born on a farm just down the road. And so they were able, when I was doing my interviews there, to give me a complete chronicle from the 1930s to the present day at that time of how the land had changed and who lived on it and who left it and who stayed behind and all the reasons and so on. And so did other folks that participated in my study. Now, the question that you're probably asking yourself at this point is, why is this guy going on and on about the droughts of the 1930s and the Dust Bowl migration? What has that got to do with anything, right? For me, it has everything to do with everything, because when I look at the problems that many folks face today because of changing weather conditions and extreme weather events and changing climate conditions, and folks who are obliged to make decisions about whether to stay or whether to go, and if so, where will they go, and so on. The exact same factors that people take into consideration today are precisely the same factors that folks were taking into consideration back in the 1930s in the central part of the Great Plains of the United States. So it raises a couple things. One is, when we talk about environmental migration or climate-related migration or climate-related refugees, whatever you want to talk, however you want to call it, it happened in the United States in living memory, right? It's not just something that happens to people on other continents and other parts of the world that we can just sort of think about in an abstract fashion. It happened to folks who lived in your country and who are still alive to this day. They're old now. The ramifications of those decisions have impacts and implications for communities to this day as well. So it's not hypothetical, it's real stuff. And the things that we can learn as social and natural scientists from these types of case studies are extremely relevant, helping us understand our future in a changing climate. And so that's why that article you were asked to read, which uses the term evidence from analogs. Analogs just a fancy way of saying past case studies or case studies in other places. The point is that a lot of the drivers and considerations that influence the relationship between climate and human migration behavior, they're not new. They've been developing and they've been present for decades now, if not centuries. And so when I do research today, such as, with colleagues, the book on the right-hand side, you see the cover there, that's with colleagues who are working in Africa and some parts of South Asia on, the challenges that rural people face because of drought. A lot of the lessons that I learned doing my research in the southern parts of the US on migration in the 1930s, those same sorts of dynamics are taking place right now in parts of East and Central Africa right now. Okay, so there's our little discussion of analogs and what we can learn from them. Now let's talk about the present. which is probably what you folks are mostly or more interested in. So does the climate cause people to migrate? Well, elements or attributes of the climate certainly do. So extreme weather events that are linked to climatic patterns and changes in climatic patterns most definitely cause people to move. And the best data source that we have as researchers comes from an organization called the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. And what they do, they're based in Geneva, and they collect data from all around the world on instances where folks are required to leave their homes, whether it's for a few days, for a few weeks, for a few months or longer. And they collect it for a variety of reasons, whether it's conflicts or whether it's earthquakes or whether it's weather events and so on. And they categorize it. And each year they produce an annual report. The next one comes out, I think, next month in May 2022, and it will have data for the calendar year 2021. The most recent data that we have, therefore, from IDMC is for the year 2020. And what I've done here on the screen is I've separated out the weather-related displacements from all the other ones that have nothing to do with the climate. And as you can see, in the year 2020, about 30 million people worldwide were displaced from their homes because of extreme weather events, primarily extreme storms, especially cyclonic storms, because of floods, and to a lesser extent because of droughts and wildfires and extreme temperatures and other weather-related events. And that's what you can see there, the breakdown on the circles that you see there. Next year, or I guess next month, when the report comes out with the 2021 statistics, there's going to be some Canadians and Americans from the Pacific Northwest who will figure into those statistics because they lost their homes due to wildfires, and in case of Canada, also severe flooding up in British Columbia in the fall of 2021. And the fact that the United States will figure in the next report in the statistics that are collected is not all that surprising, because the United States is actually one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, and one of the countries that is most prone to having people displaced from their homes by extreme weather events and other weather-related disasters. And so these statistics in 2020 show you the top 5 countries for the number of people displaced for environmental reasons. You can see China leads the pack at over 5 million, followed by the Philippines, Bangladesh, India, then the United States, and then some other countries in Southeast Asia, in East Africa, and Central America. And if you were to look at the statistics for the last 15 years, you would find that this pattern pretty much repeats itself. China, India, Philippines, Bangladesh, US are always in the top 5. And then the second group of 5 that you see on your screen there, they tend to always be in the top 20 in terms of people displaced for weather-related events. Just to show you the American pattern, so I'm sorry for the black backdrop here, but you can see the bar chart there. This goes back to 2008, and it looks at IDMC records for displaced Americans due to weather-related events, disasters, and so on. And as you can see, it varies considerably from one year to the next, but you also see this pattern that since 2016, there's a lot of folks showing up there. Now, I cannot say for sure that's because of changes in the climate or even changes in the frequency of weather patterns. It may also be artifacts of the data collection procedures, because they have changed over since 2008 when IDMC first collected data. But what they project is based on current and recent trends is that in the US, on average, weather-related events can be expected on an annual basis to displace, close to 200,000 people per year. That's a lot of folks, right? That's like, well, you can think of a lot of cities that have 200,000 people. That's a lot of people each year who are displaced in the United States by sudden onset hazards. So it happens here, but we're also going to look at the bigger picture now. I want to talk a little bit about the global dynamics of climate-related and weather-related migration. To start with, we need to think about what international migration generally looks like, regardless of, forget about whether it's climate related, weather related, just in general, what do international migration patterns look like? If you only watch CNN or Fox News or follow on Twitter or on the internet, folks who talk about migration a lot in the US, what you tend to see are discussions based around the US-Mexico border. And this is from last year, but I'm sure most of you remember these images where you had migrants, a lot of them from Haiti and other places, living under a bridge at Del Rio, Texas. And when Americans think about migration, that's tend to how they see the migration world, if you will, is the US-Mexico border. But that's really just a tiny snapshot of what's actually going on in terms of international migration patterns. And so there was this great study. It's about, going on 7 or 8 years now. It's been published, but it was by a couple researchers, Abel and Sander, who sat down and looked at migration flows around the world for a fixed period of time, 2005 to the year 2010. And so what they did was they collected statistics from World Bank and IOM and other organizations and looked at where people come from and where they're going. And what they discovered is that most international migration tends to be within the same region. So people tend to migrate to countries that border their own country, contiguous countries within the same region. So if you're from Niger, you tend to migrate to Nigeria or Burkina Faso and so on. If you're from Nepal, you tend to migrate to India. Sure, there's folks who migrate over longer distances, but most people who migrate internationally stay within the same geographical region. And that international migration is really much smaller than the amount of migration that takes place within countries, right? So it's estimated, for example, that within China, there's over 800,000 people, maybe, sorry, I've got my statistics wrong in my head. Scratch that. Within China, there are a much larger number of people. I won't give you the absolute number because I've forgotten it now in my head, but there's much larger number of people within China who have moved than migrate annually at a global scale, right? The point being is that most migrants move within their home countries, and you know that, right? Most Americans move within the United States. They don't move to Canada or Mexico, and most international migrants move within the same geographical region. And not surprisingly, Asia is the biggest source of international migrants. And that's not surprising because it's also the most populated continent of all the continents as well, right? But so this diagram, this pinwheel diagram that you see here on the right-hand side of the screen, it shows all the different regions of the world, and the little colored lines show, people moving from South America to this part of the world, and people moving from South Asia to that part of the world, and so on. Let's just focus on North America. Folks who migrate to North America, where do they come from? They come primarily from Central America, from South Asia, so India, Pakistan, places like that, from East Asia, so China, Hong Kong, and so on, and Southeast Asia, right? So that's where folks who come internationally to North America come from. That's actually a little bit of an anomaly in that there's so many people coming from Asia to North America. It's pretty far, right? It's not within our region. The biggest source of migrants is within our region, Central America, but we still get a lot of folks from Asia coming here. So if you're trying to imagine what the future of migration might look like in a changing climate, the baseline or your starting point are current migration flows, and those current migration flows lead, in the case of North America, from Central America and from East, Southeast, and East and Southern Asia, right? So those are our two migration flows. And so in a changing climate, the first thing we should expect is changes or perhaps increases in flows along those pre-existing migrant routes, because as we know, where there's pre-existing migrant connections, there's a greater chance of more migrants joining them. And so let's look a little bit more carefully at these key drivers or key causes of climate-related migration: flood, storms, and droughts. And in certain parts of the world, including the West Coast of the United States, wildfires are starting to become a more important driver of migration. Each of these weather-related events triggers different types of changes in migration patterns. So floods, for example, tend to result in temporary displacement. So what happens is you have a river valley, it gets flooded. The folks who live in the river valley, they move out to nearby urban centers where they shelter until the flood waters recede, and then they go back home and they see what's left. In the case of North America or Europe, if they're lucky, they've got insurance money so they can choose whether they want to rebuild in the same place or whether they want to move elsewhere. Many parts of the world, there are no insurance regimes, so people go home and they take a look around and see whether it's worth rebuilding. And in most cases, people do tend to go back and rebuild back in the river valley because, you know, there was a reason why they lived there in the first place. The economic opportunities, the farming opportunities, whatever it was that kept them there in the first place, they're still good after the floods have left. The only time that people really move permanently away from a flooded area is if their houses, their livelihood assets are all destroyed, they have no economic means of rebuilding. Typically also their community is also badly damaged. They've got no friends or neighbors that they can draw upon for assistance. That's when you see people relocate. And when they do relocate, they tend to go to the nearest urban center. Extreme storms are a bit different than floods. And a lot of it, in terms of the migration outcome, depends on what the government does, what the authorities do, right? Because a hurricane like the one you see on the left-hand side there, like that one I think is Katrina, the picture on the left. The one on the right is the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico a few years ago, Hurricane Maria. Hurricane blows through your community. Essentially, you know, 90% of the houses get damaged. The infrastructure gets badly damaged. There's a lot of floods and so on. The next question, and everybody evacuates, of course, if they can, then the next question is, do they come back and rebuild? And a lot of that depends upon the response of the authorities. So in the case of Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, I don't know if you folks remembered this, but President Trump flew down after the hurricane and was photographed tossing rolls of paper towels to survivors. And that's about the extent of the financial assistance that the US government provided to survivors of Hurricane Maria. I exaggerate a little, but not a lot. The US government essentially left Puerto Rico high and dry. So what did people from Puerto Rico do? They migrated to the continental United States, to Florida, to New York City and areas where there were large pre-existing Puerto Rican communities, so where they had friends and connections and neighbors, and folks migrated from Puerto Rico to the United States in order to earn money, to remit home, to rebuild their homes and their livelihoods of those who stayed behind. You know, that's what I say, is that the authorities, the response of the authorities has a lot to do with what happens after the fact in terms of migration and displacement. The third of these events, droughts, is a much different sort of phenomenon, right? Because droughts have a slower onset. It takes time for the aridity and the dryness of the land to build up. And so at the outset of a drought, people tend not to migrate, right? They tend to try to adapt in other ways, whether it's rotating crops, whether it's selling off some of their livestock, whether it's working off farm. And typically your first sort of migration response, if you will, is young people move away in search of wages so they can remit money back home. And it's only when the drought persists for longer periods of time that you start to see an increase in people moving out of the drought affected areas, like what you saw in the Great Plains of the United States in the 1930s, right? So in 1932, you have the first year of the drought, 33, 34, then you start to see people migrate in larger numbers to California. 35, 36, the migration numbers go up, right? So there's a cumulative effect. And there was a study that was done a few years back looking at Mexican migration to the United States. And what it found was that after about 36 months of drought in rural Mexico, that's when you start to see an increase in migration to the US. So that's what's happening right now, right? And like I said, these things are happening. 30 million people last year were displaced from their homes around the world from those sorts of events. Now let's start to look to the future. We've got exacerbation of all those events I just described, right? In the changing climate, the potential in a warmer climate, the potential for hurricanes to have stronger wind speeds increases. the potential for droughts to occur more frequently and last longer. It increases the potential for floods, changing precipitation patterns and so on, extreme precipitation events. The chances go up, right? So we're going to see an increase in the frequency and or severity of those types of events. Plus, layered on top of that, for coastal areas, you've got the risk of sea level rise. And so how does sea level rise, or what are the implications of sea level rise for migration and for communities in coastal areas? Well, there's a few things that it does, right? It amplifies the impacts of coastal storms and floods and king tides and so on. In other words, the water from storm surges, the water from king tides is able to penetrate inland to a greater extent. And then, of course, you've got the potential for the storms themselves. Eventually, it inundates the lowest lying areas, although typically people tend to retreat from those areas before they become permanently inundated. It's been estimated that by the year 2100, over 1 billion people will live within 10 meters of sea level. So that's an awful lot of people, right? And sea levels are expected to rise somewhere between 40 centimeters and 80 centimeters by the end of this century. So we've got a bad convergence. We've got population growth in coastal areas, and we've got rising sea levels in coastal areas, plus greater risks of certain types of weather, extreme weather events. So it's a bad combination of things that's going to emerge in coming years. And so looking at the future and trying to, and this is the final stage of my presentation here, in case you're wondering, is this guy going to talk all night? It's nighttime here. I guess it's afternoon where you are. What will the future hold? This study came out in 2021, and it was by the World Bank, and it projected that by the year 2050, extreme weather events and changes in sea level attributable to climate change could displace over 200 million people around the world, primarily in low-income countries in Central and South America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in South Asia. Two things to keep in mind. One is 2050 is not all that far away. I hope to be alive in 2050. I might be living in a nursing home eating applesauce, but I hope to see the year 2050. I hope I don't see 200 plus million people displaced from their homes by that point in time. The second thing is, look who wrote this report. It's the World Bank. It's not Extinction Rebellion. It's not Greenpeace. It's not Friends of the Earth. It's the World Bank, right? A really conservative group of folks whose primary mission is to maintain the capitalist system that we have in place right now, right? And so if these folks who go to work in suits and ties and take a very sober and conservative view of the world, if these folks say that we need to watch out because if we continue on the path we're on, hundreds of millions of people are going to be displaced within our lifetime, I think we should take that seriously, right? Even though those are high-end projections, those are worst-case scenario projections, nonetheless, the World Bank thinks that these are possibilities, right? Real possibilities. But the good thing about the future is that you may not know what it is, but you can make it the way you want it to be, right? You can influence how the future will be. And so when we talk about how many people around the world will move or need to move because of climate change, there are three key uncertainties over which we still have considerable influence that will determine whether there's 200 million people displaced from their homes or no people displaced from their homes because of weather-related events in 30 years' time. And those three key things are things that you have probably already talked about in this course with other seminar speakers as well. Maybe not the third one, but certainly the first two, which is, well, are we going to control our greenhouse gas emissions or not, right? Because a lot of this future is downstream from that one decision. Are we going to take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Second one being, are we going to allow poor people in poor countries to remain poor indefinitely, or are we going to do something about it? In other words, are we going to actively and aggressively pursue sustainable development in lower income countries? That's a really important criterion, right? And then the third one will be, well, what will the future of immigration policy look like, both within the United States and Canada and around the world? So let's just quickly walk through these three uncertainties. And I'm sure you're extremely familiar with this one, which is that Average global temperatures today are approximately 1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than they were in the pre-industrial period. And we have agreed as an international community that we will try to limit those increasing temperatures to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial temperatures. So we only have about we only have about 0.3 degrees Celsius left to play with, right? And so that's what our target is, as you see on this graph here. You can see the increasing temperatures and you can see our target that we need to get our temperatures under control. Will we do that? Will we hit that target? Well, we had last fall a lot of optimism going around the world. There was something called the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or COP26, as it was known. It was held in Glasgow, Scotland. And there, the international community promised that it would live up to its commitments in the Paris Agreement on climate change and limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's what you see there with Boris Johnson and the Glasgow Declaration, I think it was called, that, yep, we're going to stick to this. And your president took the initiative earlier last year to announce that the United States is going to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by as much as 50% by the year 2030. That was a commitment that your president made, and I genuinely hope that he is able to achieve that. I realize it's not him alone that controls that outcome, but that there's a lot of other folks in the United States who have their say as well. But of course, things have changed since last fall. We have this war in the Ukraine, and there's a lot of discussion and debate about what it will mean in terms of future greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. In the short term, what it probably means is that there will be an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, primarily because much of the natural gas that would normally flow out of Russia to Europe and to its other client states, consumption has been curtailed, and countries are amping up their production of electricity from coal and from dirtier fuels as well. So in the short term, there might be a slight uptake in the amount of carbon emissions in the next year or so. But the hope is that countries in Western Europe and elsewhere realize that fossil fuels are not only bad for the planet in terms of environmental problems, they're also bad for the planet economically as well. When you are beholden to dictators like Vladimir Putin and others for your energy supplies, that's a bad predicament to be in, right? So the hope is that this conflict will be a catalyst to accelerated adoption of cleaner energy technologies around the world. We shall see. But the point being is that the dialogue around the Paris Agreement and getting greenhouse gas emissions under control has changed considerably. I know here in Canada, where we have a very large and active oil industry, they're saying, hey, world, look at Canada. Stop buying your fossil fuels from Russia. Get them from Canada. We've got all kinds of them, and we're happy to ship them to you, whether it's, to Fargo, North Dakota, or whether it's Seoul, Korea. Just let us know, and we'll be happy to fill your tanks, right? So from a Canadian perspective, this conflict probably means that Canada's greenhouse gas emissions are going to go through the roof as we start to sell more fossil fuels on the global market. Anyhow, the point being is that the future of global migration patterns depends a lot on decisions that we make today about our fossil fuel use. And a study that came out just in the last year or so quantified the risk for future displacement and migration as it relates to flooding. And this study found that for every 1 degree Celsius of warming, the risk of people being displaced by floods around the world increases by 50%. So in your course, you may be talking about, well, what's the difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius warming and 2 degrees Celsius warming and so on? Well, one of the differences is that we increase the risk of people being displaced from their homes by about 50% if we go from 1.5 degrees warming to 2 degrees warming. So that's a big difference, right? That we're talking millions of people in addition, and millions of additional extra people who get displaced from their homes under that warming scenario. I mentioned earlier the UN sustainable goals. Are we going to continue to allow poor people to live in poverty, or are we going to do something about it? And the reality is this, is that if folks are better off financially, if socially, economically, they are better able to cope with and adapt to all of the hazards that are going to be thrown at them because of climate change, right? One of the reasons we don't see large-scale migrations in the Great Plains today, even though we still get severe droughts, is because A, we have a lot of different protections in place to keep farmers on the farm during drought. So we have crop insurance and we have financial mechanisms and so on. And we've adjusted our farming techniques so that we're better adapted to farming in dry land areas here in North America. Over in places like Niger and West Africa, or in rural Ethiopia, people are still using old technologies. They're still using, their farms are still rain fed and not irrigated, and there's no crop insurance. There's no safety net, so that when crops fail, people have to move in those countries, right? So if we can enhance the economic development of poorer countries and poorer people within poorer countries, then there's greater chance that they're able to cope with and adapt to climate change without being involuntarily displaced from their homes. And I don't know, I assume most of you are familiar with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but I mean, this is stuff we should be doing anyhow, right? We don't need climate change to be our catalyst to do this, right? When you look at these things like, make sure everybody gets enough to eat, make sure everybody has access to basic healthcare, make sure that, all kids have a chance at a decent education, we should be doing that anyhow. We don't need climate change. And then my final slide that I really want to get to is, what is our future migration policy going to look like? Right now, around the world, the trend has been in recent years towards shutting borders down and preventing people from moving across borders. And so in Europe, in South Asia, in the United States, borders are becoming fortified. Let's look at the image in the lower left-hand corner. I got this from the Twitter feed of the US Border Service. And so what you see here is a Border Patrol truck going out on its patrol with a drone overhead. And what you don't see in the background is there are sensors, there are heat sensors, there are motion detectors and so on out there. They're looking for people trying to sneak across the southern border of the United States. Back in the 1990s, when I lived in Seattle, it was no problem crossing the border from Mexico to the United States. You just walked across, right? There was no fortifications. There was a little bit of a fence over near Tijuana and so on, but it was no big deal. People walked into the United States, and a lot of them would walk into the United States, work for a time, and then they take the bus back home, right, with a little bit of money in their pockets and so on. But that has changed now. That kind of laissez-faire attitude towards the border, very different. Now we're building huge walls. We're using military technology. And it's not just the United States-Mexico border. It's Europe, right? Keeping folks out of Europe means that they have to resort to going on life rafts and trying to float across the Mediterranean. People are literally taking their lives in their hands to immigrate into the EU because the EU is shutting its borders. And same between India and Bangladesh. That doesn't bode well for a future where more people are going to be displaced from their homes because of the impacts of climate change. And where are they going to go? They're going to essentially be trapped in those areas that they would be better off fleeing because there's very few options in terms of going elsewhere. And in one way, it's also short-sighted on the part of countries like the United States and Canada and Germany and others, because our populations are aging and we need workers. We need young workers. Well, the countries on this planet that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change also tend to have lots of young people who would love the opportunity to work for wages and remit money back home. So in one sense, by fencing off our borders and preventing people from migrating, we are hurting ourselves long-term economically by doing so. And we're hurting the potential for people who are affected by climate change to use labor migration as a way of adjusting and adapting to it. Anyhow, I feel like I've talked more than long enough. So this is where I throw it back to the folks who are attending here, which is, I've just shown you the past, present, and future of climate-related migration, both from a North American context and a global context. So the question I have for you, and it's a genuine question because I don't particularly know what we should do. I have some ideas on what we might do, but what we should do. Do you folks have any ideas? Or if you want to just throw back some questions or comments to me in general about my presentation, please do so. But Luann, that's it for me from the canned part of the presentation.
So everyone, yes, so there you can put questions in chat. I actually also will allow you to unmute yourself, but I'll go ahead and read the first question. Ling has a question. Yes, thank you. It was a great talk. I don't know if you can see the claps. I'll wave my hands to thank you. So Ling is asking, I have a question. Do you think policymakers will create separate policy for refugees of war, political unrest versus climate refugees? Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, great question. And it's a very popular discussion topic right now in international policy circles, and especially those that relate to migration, refugees, and so on. And there's some sort of very strong opinions on this. So folks who have historically worked in the refugee community, so folks who work with NGOs, humanitarian organizations, and others who deal with refugees from wars and conflict and persecution and so on, they are very hesitant to see the international community create an expansion of what is defined as a refugee. And the reason simply being is we do a pretty crappy job helping folks who meet the current definition of a refugee, right? In Turkey right now, there's over 5 million refugees that essentially are not being well looked after. And so, you know, folks who want to expand the definition to create even more people eligible for refugee protection, where are the resources going to come from to accommodate those folks? So that's one perspective on it. A different perspective is from, for example, people who think about human rights and social justice perspectives as well. And their view is, look, if people are displaced from their homes involuntarily, it doesn't matter whether it's at the end of the gun or because their life savings have been wiped out by a flood or a drought. We're still concerned about the welfare and well-being of those who are impacted. And so they would argue very strongly that at very least, we need to accommodate them and assist them as best we can within their home countries, and to make sure that we are not, for example, deporting people from the United States or Canada or elsewhere back to countries where we know they're going to be exposed to future climate-related disasters. And so those are just two of many different perspectives on this. And I kind of go back and forth on it myself. When you ask me what my opinion is on whether we should create a special category or not, I think it depends on whether you ask me on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Friday, my opinion, because I can see the merits for doing so and for not doing so. So the only other thing I would add is there is something called the Global Compact on Safe, Regular, and Orderly Migration. There's also something called the Global Compact on Refugees. These were voluntary agreements that were signed at the United Nations in the last 3 or 4 years. They're voluntary, right? So countries that sign them, it's not like a treaty that you have to comply with it, but they're voluntary agreements. And if you were to look at these more carefully, you would see that they actually spell out a very rational and measured approach to dealing with people who are displaced from their homes for environmental reasons. It's actually spelled out there. The blueprint is there. The United States has not signed the agreement. The United States does not believe in it because they believe it transfers too much US sovereignty over migration policy to an international body, which is kind of a no-no in American politics. But the point being is that the plan or the roadmap on how to deal with folks displaced from climate-related reasons, we already have it. So really it's a case of whether countries want to embrace it and adopt it or not. But it's a great question, Ling Yi, and I don't know if you wanted to follow up on it or not, but great area for research as well.
Yeah. Becky, you can unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Great. A great talk. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impacts of migration on things other than sort of humanitarian consequences, which seem more obvious, but what are, just based on history, what other problems or solutions perhaps comes about because of, and sort of involuntary migration. By involuntary, I mean they're doing it because they feel that they have to because of all the reasons that you said.
Great question. I'll start with a historical example from the Dust Bowl, since I was talking about it earlier, and then I'll talk about a current example of research. So in Bakersfield, California, there was this influx in the 1930s of migrants from the Southern Great Plains, primarily Oklahoma and Texas and so on. And the migrants were heavily discriminated against by folks who lived in California already. And so, for example, the people I spoke to described that when they were kids going to school in California, they were made to sit on the floor and they weren't given desks in the schoolhouse. The reason being is that the teachers in the schools thought this would be a way of discouraging the Oklahoman migrants from sending their kids to school and then bringing with them their germs and their bad behaviors and so on. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department actually set up what they called a bum blockade at the California-Arizona border, where what they did was they essentially were watching for cars with out-of-state license plates from Texas or Oklahoma. And when they crossed the border into California, they pulled them over and essentially they shook them down and bullied them and tried to discourage them from entering the state of California. Completely illegal and unconstitutional, but nonetheless, they did this because they didn't want the migrants. And this is something that often happens, is that involuntary migrants often receive a very hostile welcome from the communities where they try to go. And so it can create tensions, it can create hard feelings or worse within the receiving communities. A more recent example, and this was published in Nature Climate Change a couple of years ago, they did research with communities in, I think it was Nairobi in Kenya, and I think it was Phnom Penh in Cambodia, but I could be wrong. Maybe it was Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. But anyhow, what they did was they chose neighborhoods that had received a lot of influxes of environmental migrants in recent years because of droughts in the case of Kenya, because of floods in the case of Vietnam, I think it was, now I think about it. And they interviewed people who lived there and said, how do you feel essentially about all these additional migrants who are showing up in your community? And the surprising outcome, positive surprise, by the way, was that most folks didn't feel terribly hostile at all. They said, well, if you lost your farm because of a drought, you got to move somewhere, and that's okay. They can come here. It's not a big deal as long as they behave themselves and so on. So there was no real hard feelings about it. So this raises the question then, is institutional responses to migration versus non-institutional responses for migration. I'm giving you a much longer answer, Becky, than you probably hoped for to this question. But my point is that your question is good, and that there are a lot of consequences that emerge from these sorts of environmental migration movements. Some of them can be surprisingly, not bad, as we're seeing in Nairobi. And some of them can actually result in increased hostility and tensions in the receiving communities as well. So the advice that folks like myself give to policymakers is that you do need to have a settlement policy. You have to make sure that if you're going to accept migrants in, whether it's for climate related reasons or other reasons, you can't just let them live in poverty or adapt for themselves. You do have to help actively incorporate them into the community. So that's that. I'll wrap that up there. I think I'll go on to the next question from Emma.
Emma, would you like to ask your question, or do you want me to read it?
Sure, I can ask it.
Thank
you so much for your talk. I thought it was really interesting. And I guess I was thinking of your example from Puerto Rico, where the lack of government aid sort of motivated people to migrate. Is there any talk among policymakers, or have you thought about like options of moving funds away from militarizing borders and to allocate resources, I guess, to the source of why people are migrating. I can imagine maybe some politicians' arguments against it, but it seems like it would make sense to put resources toward addressing the cause versus just, I guess, fighting the symptoms.
Yeah, great question, Emma. Great question. Yeah, and Puerto Rico is kind of an unusual case, right? Because they're a Caribbean island that is not legally a state in the United States, but its residents get to migrate to the United States without any impediment, unlike, say, Jamaicans or others and so on. They have the right to live in the continent of the United States. So it's an unusual situation that they can move freely to the continental United States in the wake of a hurricane. But again, coming back to it, the point is that it really was quite shameful on the part of the US government of the time to essentially turn their backs on all these folks who were displaced from their homes. Let's put it this way, if that had happened in Miami, there was no way on earth that the President of the United States would have allowed that to happen. Just no way on earth. But because it happened in Puerto Rico to Puerto Ricans, you know, you can sort of shrug it off and do as little as possible. Now, I'll let you folks debate amongst yourself what you think the reasons are for that. But anyhow, yeah, your point about where best to spend money. Militarizing the US border is super expensive, right? And so the question becomes, how might you otherwise spend that money? If the goal is to keep folks from Central America from migrating to the United States in search of employment, which is the reason that most of them are doing it, right? Is because their home countries, there's no good jobs. In many cases, there's crime or corruption or abject poverty and so on. So they don't have a whole lot to lose except and then that's why they moved to the United States. And in many cases, they're taking their lives in their hands to do so, right? And spending a lot of money to do so. So if we invested in sustainable development and, you know, created jobs and education and opportunities in the source countries, maybe folks wouldn't, well, they might migrate, but maybe they wouldn't do so in those sort of desperate conditions that we see them doing right now. So yeah, it's an open question, and there is a lot of debate about, you know, with open borders, you know, would more people migrate? And probably the answer is yes, but then the second question is that necessarily a bad thing, right? I know here in Canada, for example, right now, there are over 500,000 unfilled jobs in Canada, not enough workers to go around to fill them all, right? And so we could definitely use more migrants, right? Labor migrants to fill those jobs and so on. And one difference between Canada and the United States is we do have a more open immigration policy than you folks do down there. Your immigration policy is really complicated compared to ours. But anyhow, your question is a very valid one, is how do we spend the money? Is it better spent on preventing migration, or is it better spent on preventing people from living in poverty so that they don't have to resort to clandestine migration or illegal migration or so on?
So there's another question from a different Emma. Emma, do you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Yeah, sure. My question is about like people along coasts and whether or not you think it will be sort of a slow increase in migration, or will there be a point where like it's just pretty clear that there's just too many floods, it's not sustainable anymore, and we'll see like a sudden rush? You know, like, is it expected to be gradual or kind of like almost a paradigm shift?
Yeah, that's a great question, Emma. And it's, yeah, the question whether there's gradual changes or whether there's thresholds that once crossed, you never go back. And we can look at New Orleans as an example, right? And so Hurricane Katrina flooded the city and huge damage to infrastructure and so on. A conscious decision was made to rebuild it at tremendous financial cost. But we have, once again, a New Orleans, it's a couple 100,000 people protected by seawalls and dikes and levees and so on, and pumping stations and so on. And hopefully those seawalls will withstand the next hurricane, Category 5 hurricane that hits the New Orleans area, because there will be a next one, right? That's guaranteed. It's just a question of when. It might be next year, it might be the next decade, might be 50 or 100 years from now, but it is going to get flattened again by another Category 5 hurricane, with climate change increasing the potential that category 5 hurricanes become more common, or that what was once a category 4 might become a category 5 in coming decades. The threshold, I think, is going to be the US people's pocketbook. How often can the US government afford to go back and subsidize the rebuilding of communities like New Orleans, like Miami Beach, and so on, that are going to be increasingly hazard prone in coming decades? Because even America has there is an end to the pocketbook eventually. And so I think that will be the determinant in many of these communities, is at the end of the day, what's it going to cost to rebuild if it's damaged? So I don't think people are going to willingly move out just because they see the sea level incrementally encroaching upon their communities. Is going to be that when that big flood or that big storm flattens the community, can we afford, and are we willing to afford to rebuild? And the reality is that no community itself can afford to rebuild, right? New Orleans doesn't have enough money. The state of Louisiana does not have enough money to rebuild New Orleans. It needs the entire US government, the entire American people, to say, yeah, that's a wise use of our tax dollars to rebuild New Orleans in exactly the same spot, right? So eventually maybe folks will just say, sorry, that's it, New Orleans, you're on, that's it, you're done. I think that'll be what happens.
Wow, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think we all got a lot out of it. And I think this is something that touches so many of us in one way or another, that it's just a really important topic to think about. So I'll just wave my hands or clap or whatever.
That's fine, Luann.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Hope I didn't go on too long.
No, not at all. I think it was great. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all for participating. I know these Zoom things are such a strange dynamic and so on.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's better than not doing it at all, and we probably wouldn't have been able to hear from you. So
yeah,
I don't know. I think about it. My family actually still owns land in Kansas, much of which is still tenant farmed by, people who farm lots of acres. So it's just thinking about that.
Yeah, I still go back and do research in that part of the world.
Although my great grandparents moved to California in like the teens.
Yeah.
Earlier.
Yeah.
But it's still that model.
Yeah, and you see a lot of this if you look at the history of California. You see these waves of people from other parts of the US, the early settlement period, the gold rush, the teens. There was an economic recession in the teens, and there were some droughts as well. So folks, continued westward. You see in the 30s, see another wave in the 50s, and so on.
But they had the wherewithal to leave, but they still own the land there.
Well, that's great. I mean, it's nice to have those kind of legacies. A lot of the folks who did move to California, they didn't have the land, so they just
I know that's right.
Packed up and moved on. I mean,
anyway.
my parents, my father's family, it was the same story in Canada. We had severe droughts in the 20s and 30s in Saskatchewan and so on, southeastern Alberta. And my father's people, they were pushed out during one of those droughts and ended up in British Columbia.